Hello, and welcome to the iCost Simulations and the Efficient Frontier webinar. My name is Patrick Summers. I'm the Vice President of Delivery here at 4R Systems, and I will be monitoring this session. This presentation is the sixth webinar in a series of webinars presented by the 4R Systems Client Services team. This webinar will be recorded and be available on our website following the presentation. That'll be along with all of our previously recorded webinar sessions. As a little note before we get started, all of the phone lines are currently muted and will remain muted throughout the presentation. We will be taking questions via the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen throughout the course of the webinar, and the questions will be answered at the end of the session. We'll answer as many questions as possible as time allows. And now, I'd like to introduce you to your presenter, Stephanie DeLuca, Associate Client Manager. Stephanie?
Thank you, Pat. Hello, and welcome to the 4R Systems webinar about iCost simulations and the efficient frontier. Today, we will cover the following topics: how 4R measures for iCost simulations and models the efficient frontier, how 4R's customers leverage and utilize our simulation results, and we will go through some additional tools and views that are provided when conducting iCost simulations. Step one is gathering the data. When conducting an initial iCost simulation, we will first gather all the necessary data. We prefer at least 2 years of a customer's historical point-of-sale transaction history, along with inventory data and supply chain parameters, to then calculate the retailer's historical costs, which we then apply to generate historical 4R reorder points. Once we've identified a customer's historical costs and have generated historical reorder points, step two involves running and ordering iCost simulation against the client's current production reorder points. During simulation processing, we identify and model 12 various changes to store replenishment production settings that will improve inventory performance. These 12 settings can be identified as the iCost settings. For each week in the evaluation period of the simulation and at each iCost set of reorder points, we generate an order for the next review period given reorder point and modeled inventory position. We then also calculate ending on-hand inventory and loss margin for that same week based on arriving orders and sales from previous weeks. We do this over the evaluation period for each set of the iCost settings. To simplify, the various iCost settings essentially model inventory risk and return by evaluating the resulting loss margin dollars and inventory carrying costs associated to it. Next, in step 3, we begin plotting the efficient frontier chart. The iCost settings results are plotted on what we call the efficient frontier chart, as you can see here. In this chart, the red dot represents retailers' current settings that we identified by measuring their historical costs. The left axis illustrates loss margin as a percent of sales. It has an associated inventory level identified as weeks of supply across the bottom axis. This chart is an attempt to quickly and visually identify changes to store replenishment production settings that will improve inventory performance. As your eye moves down and right along the arch, you can detect that with the introduction of additional weeks of supply or inventory carried, you will lower the associated loss margin. The efficient frontier also has an associated profit curve that identifies the profit recapture opportunity existing with the introduction of additional inventory. This profit curve can be seen here arching over the efficient frontier in green with its correlating 12 profit settings. The profit curve has a profit maximum point at its apex peak, which we recognize as maximum profit improvement. In this chart, it is seen as 0.93% increased profit as a percent of sales. So how do 4R's customers utilize the simulation results? Let's take a closer look at the output of results illustrated here. We observe where the client is currently set. This is represented by the navy blue dot here. This retailer is currently operating at 13.11 weeks of supply. In this efficient frontier, the profit optimal answer is suggesting we introduce additional inventory, 15.33 weeks of supply, or an iCost setting of 4%. When moving to a lower iCost setting, the loss margin dollars are reduced. The simulation tool measures and weighs the costs involved in carrying additional inventory along with the resulting reduction of the loss margin to ultimately see which approach is more profitable to our bottom line. The table sitting perpendicular to this chart on the slide breaks down the data points that are plotted on the efficient frontier and profit curve. An iCost setting of 1% has the highest inventory level of over 17 weeks of supply. It's plotted farthest to the right on both curves. With maximum inventory levels at a 1% iCost, you can see the loss margin is reduced to just over $2,000 each week. Conversely, at the other extreme, the lowest iCost setting of 200% results in an inventory reduction of over $600,000 a week and just under 9.5 weeks of supply. With this inventory reduction or constraint, you will incur additional loss margin as illustrated here, reaching over $10,000 a week. The 4R method is balancing these metrics to best fit a customer's need and maximize profit. Many factors play into this profit optimal computation. Item carrying cost, sales velocity, coverage period for the supporting orders, etc., are all considered and influenced on 4R's maximum profit recommendations. Client managers work directly with the clients to achieve maximum profit while staying within the client's current inventory initiatives. For example, when there is no inventory constraint, you may decide to move all categories to their optimal iCost setting to achieve all the available profit recapture. In other cases, there may be open-to-buy limitations on what can be spent at any given time. In this scenario, we can reference the inventory investment change to easily identify the spend versus return. There are also cases where we may suggest a reduction in inventory from a client's current setting. In these cases, it's been identified that the cost of carrying the items at the client's current weeks of supply setting is eroding or outweighing the margin dollars. In this slide, we'll demonstrate how we benefit the scatter plot by SKU. This is another useful tool available to us when conducting iCost simulations. Each SKU included in the simulation tool will be plotted on this quadrant based on their profit, productivity, performance. The bottom right quad is where the low-hanging fruit exists. Inventory is reduced and yet margin is increased. Bottom right quad. How can this be, you ask? Through the simulation process, we identify key locations that were being underserviced in inventory, while others may be carried too much. 4R's recommended reorder points would address this by placing the right levels of inventory in the most profitable locations, and over time, the less profitable locations would sell down and result in a lower carrying cost. The bottom axis of this chart models the margin dollar change when making an inventory cost change, as seen on the left axis. We can also apply this method to all stores and plot them using the same approach. These benefit scatter plot charts are useful when identifying outliers. You can quickly see what stores or SKUs are most profitable and make sure that they are being protected while addressing the ones that are not, digging in a little deeper, figuring out why it's not providing a benefit and making changes when necessary. The simulation tool also gives us the ability to drill down to the SKU store level and observe what actually happened versus what the simulation tool would have done had we applied profit optimal iCost and reorder points. The text at the top of this chart walks you through the SKU store attribute as well as recaps the simulation changes. So here we have SKU 12345. It's a bird feed SKU. It exists in Department 99, which is outdoor. It's the store we're observing is location 1002. It's Berlin. So then some of the correlating attributes for this SKU, we know that the lead time is 5 days. We know that the review period is 7 days. We know that the retail is $27.99, and the cost of this item is $18.13. We know margin is 35% and case size is 1. So as we run the simulation and model each week, the ending result here is a recommendation of increasing inventory by 9 cents a week. This will result in a lost margin decrease of $2.60 a week. The chart below patterns the week-to-week behaviors against what actually happened. The red and blue dotted lines represent inventory. As your eye follows the blue and red dotted lines from left to right, observing the week-to-week patterns, the simulated inventory levels vary from what actually happened. There are instances, in most instances, for our suggested inventory levels are a little bit higher than the customer's actuals. This would help us avoid stockouts and lost sales, ultimately recapturing that lost margin referenced at the top of the chart. We can observe this at any SKU store location that's run through our simulation tool and really dig down to a detailed level, observing what is happening and making recommendations on improving profit. That takes us through a high-level observation of the iCost simulation, what it does, how we model the efficient frontier, and use it to make inventory decisions with our clients. I think at this time we can take questions.
Okay. Thank you, Stephanie. As Stephanie just said, what we'd like to do right now is open up for some questions. So by doing so, we're going to continue to keep our lines muted, but there is a chat box to the right of the webinar on GoToWebinar. So if you have any questions, just post those there, and I will pose those to Stephanie. We'll try to answer as many as we can. Let me pause for a few minutes. If you have a question, please do post them in the chat room. All right, we have one question that has come in. Stephanie, what is, if any, the difference between inventory carrying cost and iCost setting?
That's a good question. They are, in fact, very different. Inventory carrying cost is defined as the cost of carrying a unit or an item in a store. This is industry standard. You can hear this word a lot out in the market. It's used, and it includes all the overhead costs of selling an item. So that might include the value of the space or the rent, the employee that's stocking the items and operating the cash register. There's a little bit of cost involved there. So that's really explains the inventory carrying cost. Now, the iCost setting is a 4R unique terminology, and we use that to represent a setting or a dial of inventory that we can adjust to varied carrying costs as it specifically relates to our simulation and the inventory opportunities identified there.
Okay. Are there any further questions from our audience? If you would please do post those. We're going to hang on here for another 10 or 15 seconds to see if we have another question. All right. If you have any further questions, or if you think of anything regarding this webinar, this will be posted on our website. Certainly, we're also open to you contacting us directly to pose those questions. Oh, hold on. No, we actually have one more. Let me pose this other question to Stephanie. Stephanie, when we're analyzing the benefits scatter plot by SKU, which you showed earlier, why are there SKUs that seem to be having a negative loss margin and inventory carrying cost benefit in that bottom quadrant?
Right. Good question. So the scatter plot represents an accumulation of the difference in inventory carrying costs and loss margin comparing to the actual inventory carrying costs and the actual loss margin in the simulated results over the same number of weeks for a category of goods at the SKU level. So what that means is we do find that there are outliers when we run these simulations, both good and bad. As I mentioned earlier, in this situation where there might be a SKU that's resulting in lost margin or additional costs, we usually like to take a deeper dive into those SKUs and see if we can observe maybe what supply chain parameters, attributes, is it a productivity issue, what's really driving that SKU to behave that way. We usually like to address those things, come back, make recommendations on how we can try to turn that around directionally.
Okay. All right, well, thank you, Stephanie. And thank you all for attending this webinar. We have another one coming up in April, which is also through our client delivery team. All these webinars are posted on our website. They're at 4rsystems/webinars. You can also see a full schedule and all those we've done in the past. Again, I'd like to say thank you all for joining and look forward to having you join us again in a future 4R Systems Educating Retailers to Be More Profitable. Thank you.